happy July 4th to all of you. This is a special July 4th episode, and we're going to talk about the second most important document in human history after the Bible, and that is the Declaration of Independence. Why is it the second most important? Well, it started an entire new form of government that had never been tried before. Essentially, a government that was by the people and for the people. It equalized all people underneath the same framework for government that had never been done before. The Greeks had actually tried democracy before and had had some success with it, but no true representative democratic republic like the United States had ever been attempted. So it truly was a new experience. It came after many tumultuous years of the colonists, who were actually English citizens under the crown, had tried very hard to get along with the crown, get along with the British, but at the same time expressed their displeasure with taxes and other policies that had really been affecting the colonies. And so through all those years of turmoil and boiling pot getting hotter and hotter, eventually in 1775, as we saw in the last episode at Lexington and Concord, hostilities finally broke out. And the skirmishes were to be anticipated because of the incredible tensions that had been growing between the two sides. The crown was getting more and more frustrated with the colonies and trying to put down any rebellion. So they were getting more draconian in their types of methods that they were putting down on the colonies. And of course, this made the colonies more and more upset. And so the 13 colonies, although they in some ways had different priorities, were different people and came from different backgrounds, eventually united into this one big pact, which was the Declaration of Independence, happening almost a year after Lexington and Concord. If you haven't watched our Lexington and Concord episode that we did last week, I highly recommend you check it out. A lot of really good stuff there. But today we're going to talk about the Declaration of Independence in detail, the lead up to it, the drafting of it, the arguing over it, the final push to get it ratified, the signing of it by the 56 founders, and those individuals who were the 56 people that signed the document are considered our founding fathers. And then, of course, the broadcasting of it on July 4th and beyond after that, the reverberations that caused, not only around the colonies and in England, but really throughout the entire world. It spread like wildfire that the United States and the colonies had now declared its independence from England and that a true war was on. So we'll go into all the details. We're also going to look at a series of videos, including some footage from a really excellent series called John Adams, which was on HBO. There's some really great scenes in there of the founding fathers deliberating over the Declaration of Independence first draft by Thomas Jefferson. So we'll look at that. And then at the very end, we're going to talk about some interesting facts that you probably don't know about the Declaration of Independence and the entire political climate around it and what actually happened in those couple of weeks pushing this document through and getting the colonies to finally declare that they were breaking away from England. So let's go ahead and talk about the Declaration and some of the details. So Declaration of Independence, formally titled the Unanimous Declaration of the 13 States of America, is the founding document of the United States. On July 4, 1776, it was adopted unanimously by 56 delegates of the Second Continental Congress, who had convened at the Pennsylvania State House, later renamed Independence Hall, in the colonial era capital of Philadelphia. The Declaration explains to the world why the 13 colonies regarded themselves as independent sovereign states, no longer subject to British colonial rule. The 56 delegates who signed the Declaration of Independence came to be known as the nation's founding fathers, and the Declaration has become one of the most circulated, reprinted, and influential documents in world history. The Second Continental Congress charged the Committee of Five, including John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman, with the authoring of the Declaration. Adams, a leading proponent of independence, persuaded the Committee of Five to charge Thomas Jefferson with writing the document's original draft, which the Second Continental Congress then edited later. Jefferson largely wrote this Declaration first draft in isolation between June 11th and June 28th, 1776, from a second floor of a three-story home he was renting on 700 Market Street in Philadelphia. So you can imagine Jefferson really wanted his peace. He wanted to focus. And he took those 17 days in June to make sure that this draft was perfect before he presented it. The Declaration was a formal explanation on why the Continental Congress voted to declare American independence from the Kingdom of Great Britain, more than a year after the Revolutionary War had really truly begun in April 1775 at Lexington and Concord. 2 days prior to the Declaration's unanimous adoption, the Second Continental Congress unanimously passed the Lee Resolution, which established the consensus of the Congress that the British had no governing authority over the 13 colonies. And the Lee Revolution is a very interesting piece of history if you ever have some time to take a look at it. After ratifying the text on July 4th, Congress issued the Declaration of Independence in several forms. First, it was published at the printed Dunlap broadside, and Dunlap was a very famous printer at the time. And he created 200 copies of this declaration, and it was widely distributed. First, it was simultaneously distributed at noon on July 8th to all 13 colonies, and also was distributed to designated locations: Easton, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, Trenton, New Jersey, New York, and Boston. All of them received original copies. What Jefferson called his original rough draft, which was one of his several revisions he did in the 17 days, is currently preserved at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and you can go see it even today. I've actually been there several years ago, and it was really a fascinating thing to study it. They would actually give you a magnifying glass if you wanted to take a look. That version that they have there in the Library of Congress is complete with changes made by Adams and Benjamin Franklin, and it even has some of Jefferson's notes made by Congress on the actual parchment. The best known version of the Declaration is the signed copy now displayed at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., which is not too far away. You can also go take a look at that. It's popularly regarded as the original document. This copy, engrossed by Timothy Maddock, was ordered by Congress on July 19th, so this was about 2 weeks later, and was signed primarily by all 56 on August 2nd, 1776. So a lot of people don't realize that, but when the proclamation declaration was issued July 4th to everyone, it only had 2 signatures on it. And all the other signatories were put on it on August 2nd, 1776, several weeks later. The Declaration justified the independence of the United States by listing 27 colonial grievances against King George III, and by asserting certain natural and legal rights, including a right of revolution. Its original purpose was to announce independence, and references to the text of the Declaration were few in the following years. On November 19th, 1863, following the Battle of Gettysburg, so this is many years later, Abraham Lincoln made the Declaration the centerpiece of his Gettysburg Address, a brief but powerful, enduring 271-word statement dedicating the Gettysburg National Cemetery. So he considered, as you see in his Gettysburg Address, that the Declaration of Independence as our most important document. The Declaration of Independence has proven an influential and globally impactful statement on human rights, particularly in its second sentence, when Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Maybe the most important and famous sentence in human history is that one. Stephen Lucas called the Declaration of Independence one of the best-known sentences in the English language. Historian Joseph Ellis has written that the document contains the most potent and consequential words in American history. The passage came to represent a moral standard to which the United States should strive and has to live up to even today. This view was notably promoted by Lincoln, who considered the Declaration to be the foundation of his political philosophy and the philosophy of the country. It was also the statement which principles then were the foundation of the United States Constitution, which came some years later. The 56 delegates who signed the Declaration each represented each of the 13 colonies: New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Providence, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. The Declaration of Independence inspired many other similar documents in other countries throughout the years. The first being the 1789 Declaration of United Belgian Rights, which actually was issued for the Belgian Revolution at the time. It also served as a primary model for numerous declarations of independence in Europe and in Latin America, in Africa, and in Oceania after its adoption. So you can see what an important and impactful document this was, not only to our history, the European history, but really world history. So many people have used it as the model for everything that they have done going forward. So despite the growing popularity for independence, the Second Continental Congress, when they were meeting to look at this document and review it, initially lacked the clear authority to declare it. Delegates had been elected by 13 different Congresses or 13 different state governments, which included extra-legal conventions and ad hoc committees and elected assemblies. In some cases, they were bound by instructions given to them. So regardless of their personal opinions, delegates could not vote to declare independence unless their instructions from their states permitted such an action. So you can imagine what a mess it was at the Second Continental Congress, where there were some delegations that were there that couldn't act without permission from home. For Congress to declare independence, a majority of delegations would need to authorize to vote for it, and at least one colonial government would need to specifically instruct its delegation to propose a declaration of independence in Congress. Between April and July in 1776, there was a complex political war that was waged to bring about this action. So you can imagine all the different delegations, all the different political agendas, their different backgrounds, their different beliefs. All of this came to pass in the Second Continental Congress. In January of that year, 1776, Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, which described the uphill battle against British for independence as challenging but achievable and a necessary objective, was published in Philadelphia. In Common Sense, Paine wrote the famed phrase, "These are times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country, but he stands it now, deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph." And that paragraph that he wrote in Common Sense went like wildfire all through the colonies at the time. And so that spring of 1776, there was an air of independence. There was an air of revolution. The colonies were coming on board. And after Thomas Paine had rallied them in that, they were ready to go. Common Sense, as we said, made a persuasive, impassioned case for independence, which had not been given serious consideration in the colonies up to this point. Paine linked independence with Protestant beliefs as a means to present a distinctly American political identity. He initiated open debate on the topic, and he actually gave many speeches around that time as well, and took questions from the crowd. As Common Sense was circulated through the colonies, public support for independence started to grow. After reading it, George Washington ordered that it be read by his entire Continental Army troops, who were demoralized following several military defeats. A week after they read it, Washington led the crossing of the Delaware and went on one of the Revolutionary War's most complex and daring military campaigns, which resulted in very needed victories at Trenton and at Princeton. And you can take a look at our episode on Trenton and Princeton that we did a couple weeks ago, and we talked about the details of those battles and how important they were to this cause. While some colonialists still hope for reconciliation, public support for independence strengthened considerably in early 1776. In February of that year, colonialists learned of Parliament's passage of the Prohibitory Act, which established a blockade of American ports and declared American ships to be enemy vessels. John Adams, a strong supporter of independence, believed that Parliament had effectively declared American independence before Congress had been able to. So they essentially thought the war was already on. Adams labeled the Prohibitory Act the Act of Independency, calling it a complete dismemberment of the British Empire. Support for declaring independence grew even more as it was confirmed that King George had hired German mercenaries to use against his American subjects. So really you can see the boiling pot continues to boil, and the British were not helping things with all their different declarations and things they were doing to stick a thorn into the colonialists who already wanted to declare independence. Support for a congressional declaration of independence was consolidated in the final weeks of June 1776. June 14th, the Connecticut Assembly instructed its delegates to propose independence, and the following day, on June 15th, the legislatures of New Hampshire and Delaware authorized their delegates to declare independence formally. In Pennsylvania, political struggles ended with the dissolution of the Colonial Assembly, and a new conference of committees under Thomas McKean authorized Pennsylvania's delegates to declare independence on June 18th. The Provincial Congress of New Jersey had been governing the province since January 1776, and they had resolved on June 15th as well that the royal governor, William Franklin, was an enemy to the liberties of the country and should be arrested. On June 21st, they chose new delegates to Congress and empowered them to join the Declaration of Independence. At the end of June, only 2 of the 13 colonies had yet to authorize and declare independence. That was Maryland and New York. Maryland's delegates previously walked out when the Continental Congress adopted Adams' May 15th preamble and had sent to the Annapolis Convention for instructions. On May 20th, the Annapolis Convention rejected Adams' preamble, instructing its delegates to remain against independence. But Samuel Chase went to Maryland, and thanks to local resolutions in favor of independence, was able to get the Annapolis Convention to change its mind on June 28th and authorize independence. So then only New York delegates were unable to get revised instructions at the time. When Congress had been considering the resolution for independence on June 8th, the New York Provincial Congress told the delegates to wait and hold off. But on June 30th, the Provincial Congress evacuated New York as British forces approached and would not convene again until July 10th. This meant that New York delegates would not be authorized to declare independence until Congress had already made its decision. So essentially, as delegations, all the states, 12 of them, voted for independence. New York had abstained. The reason being they had not yet heard back from their congregations, because the congregations had to flee from England. By July 10th, they were able to ratify. So in terms of the actual declaration itself, it's broken into different sections. There's an introduction section where it says, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which laws of nature and laws of God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. So that's the introduction section. Then there's the preamble section. That's the we hold truths to be self-evident section. Then there's an indictment section where they talk about the 27 grievances that the colonies had against England at the time, and they're very lengthy, the different grievances. And then there's a section after that called the failed warnings section, where essentially the colonies are declaring that we've been telling you this for many, many years, that we wanted you to right all these injustices, and you never did. As a matter of fact, you went the other direction on us. So that's the failed warnings section. There's the denunciation section. Then finally, there's the conclusion section, where essentially they declare independence and the reasons why are above. And then the final section is the signature section. And as we said before, only John Hancock and the president of the Continental Congress were the only two that affixed their signatures on the first day. And then all the other signatures, the other 54 founders, were signed on August 2nd, almost a month later. So that's a little bit of background behind the Declaration of Independence. We're going to go now to a series of videos, and we'll talk about them on the other side.
The Declaration of Independence by the RBE Library. The Revolutionary War broke out on April 19, 1775, and this was the war between the American colonists and England. By the time the Second Continental Congress met in May of 1775 to discuss stronger action for independence, tensions in the American colonies ran very high. Colonists who did not wish to remain British subjects called themselves patriots, and those who remained faithful to England called themselves loyalists. On June 11, 1776, the Second Continental Congress met at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where they appointed a committee of 5 men to write a Declaration of Independence from England. Those 5 men were Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. Thomas Jefferson wrote the first draft, and the committee declared it to be almost perfect. The committee presented the document to the Congress after making a few corrections, and following a few more changes, Thomas Jefferson's work was approved. Church bells rang out on July 4, 1776, the day the Declaration of Independence was adopted and our nation was officially born, when 56 members of the Continental Congress signed the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence has 5 parts. They are the preamble, the statement of human rights, charges against human rights, charges against the king and parliament, and the statement of separation and the signatures. The main purpose of the Declaration of Independence was to announce the colony's separation from England. It also stated why the colonists wanted to separate from England. The Declaration of Independence states that all men are created equal and are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These ideas would be expressed again in the new republic's constitution, and these ideas form the basis of our beliefs about the role of our government in our lives today.
So you can see so many interesting things to talk about there out of that series of videos. The first one is how deliberative these founding fathers were when they were drafting the document. Thomas Jefferson going off for 17 days to write it. And then you saw the famous painting. And of course, then the 3 of them, after they had done their conversing on the document that Jefferson had created. Of course, legend is that Jefferson did not like people editing his work. And you can see he was allowing them to do it, but it was really bothering him. And he said, I chose every single word very deliberately. It took me 17 days to create this. And so, but he allowed them to do it. And of course, then it went to the Continental Congress, and they made even more edits beyond that, which was to be expected. So good news is that for Jeffersonians is that most of Jefferson's original draft made it through, with some edits by Adams, Franklin, and of course the Continental Congress. So you saw that kind of deliberation that was taking place. Then you saw the actual proceedings when they went ahead and voted on the Declaration. That vote, of course, took place on July 2nd, as we said before. And that's when the actual Declaration took place. And so many historians say that really our Independence Day should be July 2nd, not July 4th. July 4th was the day it was read aloud in public for the first time, as you saw in the video of them reading it on the steps there at the Continental Congress. But July 2nd is when they took the vote, and 12 colonies voted for it. Maryland had just received word 2 days before that they were allowed to vote for it. And as we mentioned in the lead-in, that the New York delegation still had not received word yet. So they ended up having to abstain. And New York ended up voting for it several days later on July 10th. So really interesting facts there. You can see one of the most fascinating things in that series of videos. Not only are the actors very good, I thought they did a great job in that series, John Adams, but they all sit in kind of stunned silence after they voted for a declaration. They didn't quite know what to do. They had been building up to this moment for many years. They had, really anticipated what this meant. Just signing the document meant you were potentially putting your life at risk. You could be hung for treason. And after they finally got the vote, really John Adams was visibly happy. He smiled a little bit, but most of the others sat there very stoic, not moving, looking straight ahead, and really in a lot of ways not knowing what to do, didn't know what was going to come after this. So it must have been just amazing to be in that room on July 2nd, 1776, and those several days afterwards when it was read aloud, and then it was published by Dunlap, the 200 copies that then got distributed all over the colonies. And one of them went to George Washington so he could read them to his troops. Really incredible stuff. Then at the very end, you saw the decoding program was talking about the Declaration. There's lots of little tidbits to consider when it comes to the history of the Declaration itself. The first one being the original copy was lost. It was actually sent first to be copied by Dunlap, 200 copies, and then the original was sent to Congress and was lost within the first year. No one really knows what happened to it. So what is actually appearing there in the Library of Congress and in the National Archives are copies with all 56 signatures that were done on August 2nd. And they're essentially Dunlap copies, 2 of the 26 that are known. You also heard the anecdote there about, they continue to find some of these Dunlap copies in very strange ways, sometimes at yard sales, garage sales. They'll find them behind paintings. So really the search is on for more of the Dunlap copies, and then also, of course, the original. We'll see if that ever does show up again. And then one of the more interesting things there towards the end was some of the discussion around, did Thomas Jefferson really write it, or did Thomas Paine write it? I think from everything I've researched the past week, it's pretty clear Thomas Jefferson did write it as stated, and that he did it very much with inspiration from what Thomas Paine had written earlier that year in Common Sense. And that the Continental Congress very much trusted Thomas Jefferson as the best writer of the founders. They really trusted him to put this draft together in those 2 weeks. And then the final interesting thing there at the very end, you heard about Thomas Jefferson Beale, and that many years later he had come along and he had buried $65 million worth of treasure. They think he might have gotten it from a pirate. They have no idea where he buried it. There's some who think he buried it in Virginia. There's some who think he buried it in Louisiana, and that he wrote 3 letters to be decoded to be able to find out where the treasure is buried, how much of the treasure is there, and then other instructions on what should happen to the treasure after it's found. They've decoded one of those 3 letters. The other 3 they've been unable to decode. The first one is about the location. They've been unable to decode it. They have actually searched and dug all over Virginia to find out where it might be, have been unable to locate it. There's some people in that decoding program, if you watch the rest of it, and I'll put it in the comments down below, who believe it's actually in the New Orleans area. And that's actually where Thomas Jefferson Beale spent the later portions of his life, and that he might have buried it there, and that he was friends with and a lawyer for one of the famous pirates at that time who might have had access to this kind of gold. So, so many interesting things. And of course, the movie National Treasure, which is a really great movie with Nicolas Cage, was based on this Thomas Jefferson Beale treasure map off of the Declaration of Independence, which is a really interesting thing that it was based on a true story. So anyway, we're going to go ahead and talk now about some of the little known facts about the Declaration of Independence. All right, first one we did talk about before, but let's just talk one more time about it, and that is Independence Day really July 2nd? Officially, Continental Congress declared its freedom from Britain on July 2nd, 1776, when it approved a resolution, and delegates from New York were permitted to make a unanimous vote on July 10th. John Adams thought July 2nd would be marked as the national holiday for generations to come, and he said so at the time. And actually several founders at the time were stating July 2nd was the day. So July 4th is when the Declaration was adopted. After voting on independence, the Continental Congress needed to finalize a document explaining the move to the public. It had been proposed in draft by the Committee of 5, Adams, Sherman, Livingston, Franklin, and Jefferson. And it took 2 days for Congress to agree on those edits. So that's why it happened on July 4th, and when they announced it to the public on July 4th. So 6 people signed the Declaration and also the Constitution. So in a future episode, we'll be talking in detail about the Constitution, but there were only 6 of those 56 founders that signed both the Declaration and the Constitution. Those 6 people were George Read, Roger Sherman, Robert Morris, George Clymer, James Wilson. So those were the 6 that were able to sign both documents. In terms of the Declaration being signed, we mentioned that it was not signed until August 2nd, almost a whole month later. So when it got to August 2nd, there were only 2 individuals' names that were actually on the original copy. And of course, we mentioned that was John Hancock and also the vice president of the Congress at the time. So the Declaration's association with Independence Day on July 4th actually came from a lapse of memory. So historian Pauline Maier said in her 1997 book about the Declaration that no member of Congress recalled in early 1777 that it was almost a year since they declared their freedom from the British. They finally remembered on July 3rd, and July 4th became the day that seemed to make the most sense for celebrating independence. So kind of funny that a whole year later, they kind of forgot about July 2nd, and on July 3rd, they remembered it and said, oh, wow, we need to celebrate July 4th because that's the day. So it was almost a lack of memory that made it July 4th was the day. The Declaration suffered from a lack of early respect. Mayer also said the Declaration was stuck in a feud between Federalists, John Adams, and Republicans of Thomas Jefferson. So we have mentioned in previous episodes about the political rivalry between those two. The Declaration and its anniversary day weren't widely celebrated until the Federalists faded away from the political scene after the 1812 war. So July 4th was kind of an afterthought until after 1812, and then it became a huge national holiday. The Declaration and Constitution were hidden during World War II. This is an interesting fact. Both documents got packed up 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor bombing by the Japanese. They were given a military escort to Fort Knox in Kentucky, where they remained until late 1944. It's really interesting that for an entire year, the country protected those two documents, the Declaration and the Constitution, as national treasures and put them in Fort Knox. And then in terms of the message written on the back of the Declaration of Independence in the movie National Treasure, which we just mentioned, a secret message was written on the back of the Declaration as a key plot device. In reality, there's a visible message on the back that reads, Original Declaration of Independence, dated 4th July, 1776. It's not as dramatic as the movie, and the experts believe it was a label added at some point when the Declaration was in storage. So it might not have even been added at the time. It was likely added many, many years later when it was being stored and rolled up. We mentioned that there's multiple copies of the original Declaration of Independence. So after the adoption of the Declaration of Independence, the Committee of Five, Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, Sherman, and Livingston, were charged with overseeing the reproduction of the approved text. This was completed at the shop in Philadelphia of the printer John Dunlap. We mentioned the Dunlap copies. On July 5th, the day after, Dunlap's copies were dispatched across the 13 colonies to newspapers, local officials, commanders of the Continental troops. These rare documents, known as Dunlap broadsides, predate the engrossed version signed by the delegates. Of the hundreds thought to have been printed on the night of July 4th, only 26 copies survive. Most are held in museums or library collections, but 3 are privately owned. When news of the Declaration of Independence reached New York City, it started a riot. July 9, 1776, a copy of the Declaration of Independence had reached New York City. So this is 5 days later. With hundreds of British naval ships occupying New York Harbor, revolutionary spirit and military tensions were running high in the city. George Washington, commander of the Continental forces in New York, read the document aloud in front of City Hall. A raucous crowd cheered the inspiring words and later that day tore down a nearby statue of George III. The statue was subsequently melted down and shaped into more than 42,000 musket balls for the fledgling American Army. So another interesting fact, 8 of the 56 signers of the Declaration were actually born in the UK. So most of them, 48 of them, were born in the United States or the colonies at that time, but 8 of them actually were born in Britain. So we had Button Gwinnett and Robert Morris, both born in England. So was Francis Lewis, born in Wales. James Wilson and John Witherspoon were born in Scotland. George Taylor and Matthew Thornton were born in Ireland. And James Smith hailed from Northern Ireland. So very interesting that these 8 individuals who were born over in the islands had come over, become Americans, and actually signed the Declaration. So one other interesting fact, one signer of the Declaration of Independence later recanted his declaration. Richard Stockton, who was a lawyer from Princeton, New Jersey, became the only signer of the Declaration of Independence to recant his support for the revolution. On November 30th, 1776, the hapless delegate was captured by the British and thrown in jail. After months of harsh treatment and meager rations, Stockton repudiated his signature on the Declaration of Independence and swore his allegiance to King George III. A broken man, when he regained his freedom later, he took a new oath to the loyalty of the country and to the state of New Jersey in December 1777. So he did recant his loyalty because he was a desperate man in captivity, but then later came back to the cause a year later. Another interesting fact, there was a 44-year age difference between the youngest and oldest signers of the Declaration. So the oldest signer was Benjamin Franklin, who was 70 years old, from Pennsylvania. And as many of you know, he was known as the grandfather of the country. The youngest was Edward Rutledge, who was a lawyer from South Carolina, and he was only 26 at the time. So he was a full 44 years younger than Benjamin Franklin. So pretty interesting fact there. The University of Virginia Library's copy was likely stolen from George Washington. There's a strong possibility that the Albert Small copy of the Dunlap broadside, now at the University of Virginia, once belonged to George Washington. Its provenance can be traced back to the early 19th century when it was in Tobias Lear's possession. Lear, who was Washington's personal secretary late in life, is known to have taken a number of documents, possibly including this broadside, from Washington's papers shortly after his death in 1799. The library also owns an additional copy that it purchased in the 1950s, but it's in poorer condition. It's pretty interesting that the University of Virginia Library has two copies of the Dunlap broadsides, one of which might have been owned by George Washington. Hancock had the broadsides distributed to be read and posted. Additional printings quickly multiplied throughout the colonies to spread the news of independence. The collection includes a copy of the Philadelphia newspaper, as well as the newspaper's reports from all the other colonies as to their reaction to independence. So pretty interesting that Philadelphia Evening Post was the first to declare it. Thomas Jefferson was just 33 years old when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. He had already become a well-known and accomplished writer even by 33. He received help from John Adams and Benjamin Franklin to draft the revolutionary document he called An Expression of American Mind. He left explicit instructions that he wanted his gravestone to be inscribed, "Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and the father of the University of Virginia." So you can see all the things he accomplished in his life. Those are the three things he was the most proud. The New York delegation at first abstained from adopting the Declaration in the July 4th meeting. As I said later, they adopted it on July 10th. The instructions apparently on its way to Congress to allow the delegation to make their vote in the affirmative. Actually, that courier got grabbed by the British, and that person was captured, and that's why the instructions didn't get there on time. So pretty interesting. New York would have been a yes, but that courier had been captured by the British and put into captivity. Ralph Tremblay's lithograph of the Founding Fathers signing the Declaration depicts a fictional event. So the lithograph produced a painting by John Trumbull, which today hangs in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol, commissioned by Trumbull in 1817 to make the painting, even though it does not include all of the signers together on July 4th. So very interesting. It's a famous painting. It's one of the most famous paintings of all that shows that event, but he actually left out quite a few of the famous signers in that painting and really focused in on the most famous ones. The signers knew what they were doing might cost them their lives. So Benjamin Rush, representative of Pennsylvania, wrote that their action that day was believed by many at the time to be our own death warrants. The British did target the Founding Fathers, destroying and looting many of their homes. There's a story that John Hart of New Jersey, when he came out of hiding and returned home, never found all of his children. So you can just imagine what the retribution must have been on these people, on their homes, on their estates, on their families, on their possessions. And many of them, of course, either lost their lives later on or, joined the cause and had to pay for it in many different ways. It's very interesting. These men were willing to give up their lives for this event and give up their lives for freedom. Another interesting fact, the Marquis de Lafayette hung an official engraving of the U.S. Declaration of Independence in his bedroom suite in Paris. So he found this document so inspiring, and of course it ended up inspiring the documents that came later in the French Revolution. He actually got this official engraving from John Quincy Adams, who had commissioned William J. Stone to make the official facsimile of the Declaration in 1823. And two of the State Department ones were given to Lafayette for his service to the country. It's really interesting facts there. that maybe you didn't know. And hopefully it makes you want to dig a little bit more into the Declaration of Independence, its history, how it came about, all the different ramifications, the politics, the war that was already going on for a year up to that point, the consequence and the significance of this document to our history and to really world history. This is the first time that a citizen government had been tried. And it was a new experiment. And of course, was so successful that this country became the most powerful country on earth, the most successful democracy in history, and has become the model for many countries since. Our documents, our way of life, our form of government, all models for many other countries to copy. So hopefully you enjoyed that, and please like this video, subscribe to the channel. We have many more things coming your way. Hope you have a fantastic July 4th, and hope you love history the way we do. Have a great evening.